Welcome. I'm Kenneth Marcus, founder and chairman of the Lewin D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on Holocaust denial and erasive anti-Semitism. This is part of our series of shining a light on anti-Semitism in the corporate world. The Brandeis Center is primarily focused on fighting anti-Semitism in a campus environment, but what we have found in recent months and years is that what starts on the campus increasingly shifts towards the boardroom. For today's event, we are discussing a topic appropriate for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Not so much the Holocaust itself, but rather some of the lessons that we might learn from the way in which Holocaust memory is denied or distorted. We don't want to compare the Holocaust to anything that has happened subsequently, but we also do not want to miss an opportunity to learn its lessons. Holocaust denial is a rather extraordinary form of mistake. It is no mere factual error. It requires that the denier believe and perpetuate the notion that Jews are capable of a hoax so massive that Jews are capable of misleading the entire world in a way that utterly changes the understanding of history. In other words, it is built on many of the age-old defamations of the Jewish people. We find that some of those defamations apply today as well, and they apply, for instance, to some of the ways in which Jewish identity is denied, mistaken, erased, and substituted for erroneous notions of who the Jewish people are. We have speakers today with different expertise who can shine light on different aspects of this problem. We're very pleased to have very distinguished people joining us. Yfat Barak-Cheney is the World Jewish Congress's Director of International Affairs and Human Rights, where she also leads the organization's efforts on combating online hate. She has worked at international organizations, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Justice, and international NGOs focusing on international law, human rights, transitional justice, refugees, migration, and other topics. Now, the founder of the modern Jewish Pride movement, a Jewish leader, a Jewish thinker, and a Jewish educator, our second panelist, Ben M. Freeman, is the author of Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People and Reclaiming Our Story, the Pursuit of Jewish Pride. He is also a Jewish diplomat for the World Jewish Congress and a research fellow for the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism Policy. Our third speaker, Arthur Traldi, well known to people who have been watching our series before, is a senior counsel right here at the Lewin D. Brandeis Center and an experienced international human rights lawyer. He has worked on legal issues related to discrimination and discriminatory violence in the United States, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, and has served as lead counsel for American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists amicus briefs at the Supreme Court on Holocaust restitution issues. I'm also very pleased to say that my colleague, Alyza Lewin, the president of the Brandeis Center, will be joining us. She will be moderating the event and also taking questions and answers afterwards to the extent that people use the Q&A box or chat function as part of this Zoom. Alyza is also the former president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and the founder or co-founder of the law firm of Lewin and Lewin. With great pride, I introduce this panel, beginning with our moderator, Alyza D. Lewin.
Thank you very much, Ken. And I believe we're starting now with Yfat. So I'm going to hand over the table to you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak on the issue of Holocaust denial distortion. As around the world today and tomorrow we commemorate the Holocaust for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And also this interesting combination that the Brandeis Center is doing between the issue of Holocaust denial and distortion, and erasive anti-Semitism, which really brought myself to think about how these two work together and how they influence each other. So thank you for doing that combination. In my short remarks now, I will focus on the issue of Holocaust denial and distortion, why it matters, and hopefully at the end get a few minutes to just discuss how this is prevalent online and social media and other platforms, really building on a research projects that the World Jewish Congress is doing with UNESCO and the UN Holocaust program, and a report that we published in July 22, which you will receive a link in the chat at the end of my remarks. You can find the report and look at it more in depth. So Holocaust denial and distortion is not a new phenomenon, right? It exists basically from when the persecution of Jews by the Nazis and their collaborators existed. So it is receiving a lot of renewed attention these days, and it's definitely spreading much faster and much wider as well. In large part, this has to do with our online world and the ease in which information is created, how truthful you can make it seem today, and how easily you spread it. But also, as our world and opinions become more extreme, more divisive, these are the times where we see anti-Semitism grow and where we see the rise of Holocaust denial and distortion grow as well. And this is true even when we see that the interest and the care about the Holocaust remains very high in many parts of the world. We see a lot of studies that indicate that there are gaps in substantive knowledge about the Holocaust. There are a lot of myths and misconceptions circulating, and just a level of historical understanding, even in countries where Holocaust education is highly developed, is very poor. So this is beyond where you see just willfully denying the Holocaust happen. We still see huge gaps, and that's the place where a lot of Holocaust denial and distortion finds its way in. So what are we looking at? The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, defined Holocaust denial as any attempt to claim that the Holocaust, the Shoah, did not take place, right? Well, we have a new tool in the past year, which on January 20th, 2022, the UN General Assembly adopted by consensus, by the way, Yfat Iran. It's a story for a different forum, but a resolution on Holocaust denial. And the resolution notes that, Holocaust denial refers to discourse and propaganda that deny the historical reality and the extent of the extermination of the Jews by the Nazis and their accomplices during the Second World War, what is known as the Holocaust or the Shoah. But it does a few very interesting things on the global forum, which is the UN. It adds to this also putting in doubt that the principal mechanisms of destruction, such as gas chambers, mass shootings, starvation, and torture, questioning that as part of Holocaust denial. And also questioning the intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people is Holocaust denial and distortion. And one more thing that does, which is very relevant for my remarks today, it notes, bearing in mind that Holocaust denial in its various forms is an expression of anti-Semitism. So we're looking at various forms of denying the Holocaust and distorting it. We're looking at either excusing or minimizing the impact of the Holocaust or its elements, minimizing the number of victims, attempts to blame the Jews, stating that the Holocaust is a positive historical event, or blurring the responsibility for the death camps, the concentration camps, or the Holocaust in general. So there are a lot of different forms. I'm going to get to this in a couple minutes as what we saw online, so it'll be even clearer. Distortion is not denying that the Nazis and their collaborators sought to murder the Jews of Europe, but still significantly and purposely misrepresenting the historical record, right? It's increasingly playing out, especially in Europe. We see this a lot, where a lot of times the genocide of the Jews is either framed in opposition to, or even in like competition to Nazi crimes against other groups, or in general part of public commemoration of the Second World War. It plays into a lot of issues of national identity. So a lot of times we see that changes in Holocaust memory and memory of World War II in Europe as part of national dialogue and building a new national narrative and story in different European countries, or a lot of invoking of the Holocaust as, seeing as the Holocaust as a symbol of absolute evil in a sense, comparing it in ways that trivialize or diminish what the Holocaust actually was, making some false equivalences or misappropriating the Holocaust to further a specific political or moral agenda. Another way we see it sometimes, even though it's universalized as being, the Holocaust happened to a lot of different populations in many areas. It's not just the persecution of the Jews and the murder of the Jews, and as the UN mentioned, the intentional murder of the Jews. So even when this is not intentionally done or unrecognized, it's still part of these deep-rooted unwillingness to confront the historical reality of the Holocaust, that this was a genocide of Jews committed and facilitated by non-Jews. And one more interesting thing that we see with Holocaust distortion is that it really trails world events and shifts in form depending on current affairs, areas of public concern, and the news. We saw this very strongly in recent years with COVID-19. We saw Holocaust distortion and the misuse of Holocaust symbols and ideology as part of protests against measures, to mitigate COVID-19 spread, and of course, other ways of anti-Semitism that were prevalent with COVID-19. So why does this matter? Hardcore Holocaust deniers are often far-right extremist ideologists with very deeply anti-Semitic worldviews. Right? It's part of this anti-liberal, ultra-nationalist position, trying to rehabilitate fascist neo-Nazi political movement, right? So they're very racist and anti-Semitic at their core. Their ideology, it goes beyond religious intolerance. It sees Jews as an existential enemy seeking to destroy the white race. This is all over the news. I don't need to dive into it. But in their view, the Holocaust is just a tool of Jewish conspiracy to achieve global dominance, right? And while this is widely associated with far-right neo-Nazi movements, Holocaust denial is also found in other extremist movements, radical Islamists, as well as on the far left, often part of this anti-globalist, anti-capitalist discourse that sees, the anti-Semitic currents that Jews are part of global capitalism, global money, global power, etc. So another Jewish conspiracy is about Jews in power. And so basically a degree of anti-Semitism must be at play in any acceptance of Holocaust denial, as was already said here earlier. So however you dress it up, it's still part of anti-Semitic notions, right? They rely upon and they recirculate these age-old anti-Semitic myths and tropes that Jews are devious, untrustworthy, manipulating the world through plots and conspiracies. Deborah Lipstadt, now U.S. Special Envoy on combating anti-Semitism, put it out nicely. She said, the first question that anyone would ask when hearing this is, why would Jews make this up? And then it's not possible to be seduced by these arguments of Holocaust deniers without at some level believing these anti-Semitic tropes that Jews are devious, powerful, and manipulative, and capable of creating what, say, Hawks Holocaust or fake Holocaust idea, right? So all of this really has significant consequences today for our public knowledge, for our memory, for our discourse. They've threatened our understanding of one of the most tragic and violent histories of our times. And the more we let such ideas circulate and become popular, the wider they spread, the harder it will be to stop them, right? And with the online world being so welcoming to such ideas, we'll soon just not be able to separate truth from lies. We will not be able to claim established narratives. We will face the erasure of Holocaust history, and with it, a significant and important part of our ability to prevent genocide in the future. So Holocaust denial and distortion is not a historic academic discussion like people like putting it. It is hate speech. It's aimed at delegitimizing and erasing the Jewish people and his Jewish history. I know I want to take 1 minute, and then if it comes up again at the end, I will say something about how we see this coming to life online. We did a study published with UNESCO and the UN in July 2022, where we looked at Holocaust distortion, especially online. And we looked at how it manifests itself online, not just the numbers. The numbers are alarming. 16.4% of all Holocaust information we looked at across popular platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Telegram, was Holocaust denial distortion. In some places, it was extremely alarming. On Telegram, which is not moderated, 50% almost of the information was Holocaust denial distortion. If you look at, I mentioned the issue of where Holocaust education is prevalent, 80% of information in German about the Holocaust on Telegram, 80% was Holocaust denial distortion. So we see that this is especially a problem. Looking at this online, we could see what the problems are. And we also looked a lot at how it manifests itself online, so what forms it takes on. And then we categorized it into a few categories that I'll just mention briefly. Celebrating the Holocaust, in one category, blaming the Jews for the Holocaust, saying that they caused their own genocide, or they were complicit in the Holocaust, or deserved the Holocaust in a way. Is another form we see this online. Delegitimizing the Jewish state and Jews through the use of Holocaust. Smearing, which is basically claiming that the Jews exploit or seek to benefit from the Holocaust, that it's given more importance than it deserves, or that Jews talk too much about the Holocaust and use it to manipulate others, is another form that we see a lot online. And equating the Holocaust, and this is a sensitive topic, I can go into it further in a discussion, but basically using the Holocaust and as the rhetorical force of the Holocaust to serve a political or social or moral agenda without actually giving it the significance and the important historical past that it deserves. So that in short are the types that we saw. The numbers were alarming. I think just time-wise, I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yfat, for giving us that introduction, particularly now connected to Holocaust Remembrance Day. And Ben, so now if you could kind of move us to today and talk about this more contemporary form of anti-Semitism that you've coined in the term and called it erasive anti-Semitism, and maybe make that connection that Yfat was referencing to how we take this and how we see it now in terms of today's forms of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. Thank you so much to the Brandeis Center for inviting me. So I, as Alyza said, named the subcategory of Jew hate, erasive anti-Semitism, and I named it in an article just after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, because I noticed something quite curious, and the fact that her Jewishness was not mentioned or was not prominent, let's say, in the mainstream articles about her passing. So mainstream, I'm meaning the non-Jewish articles. Of course, Jewish people were talking about her Jewishness, but it was not centered in the wider press. And I thought this was curious for a number of reasons. Number one, Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself centered her Jewishness. It was an important part of her law practice. But also number two, she was a member of a tiny ethno-religious community. And I know that in the United States, there are kind of misconceptions about the populations of Jews in America, but the Jews make up just 2.4% of the American population. And what I'm about to say is conjecture, but I'm quite certain there's truth to it. If Ruth Bader Ginsburg had belonged to another minority group, that would have been part of the narrative. It would have been part of the story. Let's just remember, she was the first Jewish woman to serve in the Supreme Court. She died on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and she was the first woman and the first Jew to lie in state. This is significant, but her Jewishness, an important part of her story, was erased. So that really got me thinking, and I named Erasive Jew Hate, Erasive Anti-Semitism, and I realized it did two things, and Yfat really touched on them both, actually. So the first is it erases Jewish experience, particularly with regards to Jew hate. If it acknowledges that the Holocaust in fact took place, it says that Jew hate is a thing of the past. Jew hate is not a contemporary problem. Jews are often a white privileged group who are not kind of deserving of allyship. And it frames Jew hate as not a contemporary thing. It also erases Jewish identity. So number one, again, it erases our kind of minoritized status, but it also erases our indigeneity. So the fact that we are indigenous to the land of Israel, the Levant, and it frames Ashkenazi Jews like myself as being indigenous to Europe. And there's something almost perverse about this, because when my ancestors lived in Eastern Europe, before they fled as refugees to the United Kingdom and Prussia, they were not European. They were denied access to European society. They were denied citizenship. But now we have a perverse misreading, or rather, let's be honest, false mistelling of our history to strip our connection to our indigenous land. And of course, as Yfat said, Holocaust denial, Holocaust inversion, revision, universalization is a major form of erasive Jew hatred. And it's an extreme form of it. And I think it helps us understand why it's so harmful. And Yfat also mentioned that this kind of Holocaust erasure began with the Nazis themselves, right? The Nazis were keeping what they did, or trying to keep what they did a secret. You know, once Treblinka had been dismantled after the revolt, it became farmland. So they were kind of intent on making this or keeping this a secret. And just this past week, I was, lucky enough to be invited to a Holocaust Memorial Day event at the British Foreign Office. And I was invited by the State of Israel and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And the foreign minister spoke, and he said, in these very halls that we're sitting in right now, the British diplomats of 70, 80 years ago, they didn't believe. Even when there was irrefutable evidence, they didn't believe. And even when more evidence came and they could not turn their eyes away any longer, they misrepresented it. So at that specific point, 4 million Jews had been murdered, but the British diplomat said 2 million had been murdered, and 2 million were yet to be murdered because of the chronology of the timeline. So there was an unwillingness even then to recognize the specificity of the Jewish experience. And I want to read you a quote that I came across last year. And it was by Edward R. Murray, who was an American journalist who was taken from the United States to Europe, to report on the Holocaust, on the liberation of the camps. And Edward R. Murray was touring Buchenwald, and this is what he said. "We entered. Men and boys reached out to me. They were in rags. Death had already marked many of them. One rolled up his sleeve, showed me his number. It was tattooed on his arm. Men kept coming up to me to speak. Professors from Poland, doctors from Vienna, men from all over Europe, men from the countries that made America." And this is a very telling and important and interesting testimony, because there's quite a lot of detail here. Number one, he speaks about the gender. So we know that he was not in a women's camp, he was in a men's camp. We know that there's men and boys of different age groups, so various demographics there. We know the physical condition they're in. Rags, death had already touched many of them. We know where they were from, Vienna or Poland. We know what they did, professors or doctors. But the one thing that Edward R. Murray did not think, and this is so crazy to me, he did not see fit to mention was the reason that these doctors from Vienna and professors from Poland were in that camp. And it was because they were Jews. That's the reason that these men, these Jewish men and boys, were in Buchenwald. Erasive Jew hatred in any form, but in particular Holocaust, revision, denial, universalization, is a danger to our people. It's a danger to us understanding our story and our story being understood by the wider world. We cannot allow the Jewish story to be told by others. We cannot allow our story to be rewritten. In specific reference to the Holocaust, because what a horrendous insult to the 6 million Jewish souls who were stolen from us. It is our duty to remember them. It is our duty to honor them as best we can by retelling their stories. And as Kenneth, Alyza, and Yfat all said, this is about Jew hatred. This is not about misunderstanding. This is because people hate Jews. and they want to minimize their guilt, and they also believe very firmly and very strongly in the tropes that have followed us around for thousands of years. And for us to fight this form of Jew hatred, we have to commit ourselves anew to education, because we have to understand Jew hatred is a non-Jewish problem. It is the non-Jewish world who are the ones who must really defeat this, but we take part in this fight, and we take part in this fight by educating ourselves. We have to ensure that we understand our people's experiences. We understand who and what we are. We understand things that have happened to us, whether they're good or bad. And we have to recognize that erasive Jew hatred is a threat. It is a very real threat to our people, and it's one that we must not tolerate. And this is why events like this are so important, because we're here discussing it, and we're here discussing universalization, revision, denial in this specific context. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for explaining the term, defining it, and showing us how the Holocaust distortion and denial actually fits into this larger form of anti-Semitism. I want to invite the viewers to put questions, if you have them, in the Q&A, because we'll get to that after our next speaker, Arthur. And I'm hoping Arthur now will talk about how we see this erasive anti-Semitism now encroaching in the workplace, at universities, right? How do we, what's the impact of this on people such as the individuals that the Brandeis Center works to support and help?
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order in response to your question. Normally, I would start with the Holocaust, given its uniqueness and given the timing, but I'll get to that in a moment and what I have to say about what the law has to say about that. And I think on erasure, I'd want to make a couple of points. And first, as kind of a framing point, erasure starts with anything that tells a Jew, you're not a Jew, you're something else. It would be better if that something else was something good, but of course, as Ben explained, it usually isn't. But it would still be erasure. Erasure is the chutzpah of telling somebody they don't know what they are, that you know better than they do, and you can decide on their behalf. As Ken has written, this typically includes denying Jews the opportunity to tell their own story, and is followed by classic tropes of scapegoating Jews and attempts to silence, impugn, or otherwise neutralize Jewish voices. And this is something we hear about a lot from students on campus, that at a time of high levels of anti-Semitic violence in America, at a time when the Biden administration's Office for Civil Rights and bipartisan members of Congress, as well, of course, as the Brandeis Center, as we've been doing for years, are publicly sounding the alarm about rising levels of anti-Semitism on campus, these Jewish students are told their identities and targeting don't count or aren't important enough to include in what is ironically termed inclusion programming. They're not asking for any other group to be removed or diminished. They're just asking to be included like everyone else whose members experience targeting, discrimination, exclusion, and violence because of who they are. And one of our cases out of Stanford illustrates this type of anti-Semitism particularly well, I think. One of our clients has publicly explained that while he strongly supports DEI programs in general, the one at Stanford was, quote, promoting anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories about Jews and teaching clinicians that anti-Semitism doesn't matter. And when he asked that anti-Semitism be addressed, he was told no, this would, quote unquote, derail the program. And the reason was because Jews are wealthy and powerful. The reason was based in these classic anti-Semitic stereotypes. Our other client explained that the DEI program had consciously decided not to address multiple incidents of the Nazi symbol of a swastika, a symbol that, of course, most Jews and most Americans now associate with anti-Semitism, mass murder, and genocide, being drawn on the Stanford campus or used as harassment in Zoom bots. And we see this kind of erasure, omitting Jews from the groups who need inclusion, need protection, need positive measures to be able to bring their full selves to work in corporate programs too all the time. Very few of them have employee resource groups for Jews or properly include Jews in their DEI program. This kind of erasive anti-Semitism hurts everybody because using these opportunities to dispel anti-Semitic lies is important for everybody, not just for Jews. As Ryan Greer and Eileen Hershenov pointed out on Just Security just this morning, and as Oren Jacobson talked about in our webinar last month, false anti-Semitic conspiracy theories tear societies apart, they lead to democratic backsliding, and they lead to other hate crimes. The false conspiracy theories that motivated the mass murder of Jews at a synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, and the mass murder of Black patrons at a Buffalo supermarket in 2022, are both similar versions of what's known as Great Replacement theory. And as Ken has also pointed out, are just one example of age-old conspiracy falsehoods, suggesting that shadowy Jews are controlling things for their own benefit, to hurt others, or scapegoating Jews for what the scapegoaters perceive to be societal problems. The kind of erasure we see at Stanford that tells Jews that they aren't really Jews, they're something else, and then tells everyone else to believe anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories, can also lead to serious legal issues because it can create a hostile work environment for Jewish employees who are protected under civil rights law. We see the erasure in another way legally, the erasure of targeting of Jews. We say it in federal hate crimes law. When a sloppy transition to a new federal reporting system leads to the FBI acknowledging that it's dramatically undercounted anti-Semitic hate crimes, so what real analysis suggests as an increase appears to be a significant decrease, wrongly. Or where the local FBI office first claims that the Colleyville synagogue hostage taking had nothing to do with the local Jewish community, even though the perpetrator explained his actions through several anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The person he sought to have released had spouted similar anti-Semitism, and the people taken hostage were Jews in a synagogue on Shabbat. While the FBI corrected themselves, this was a distracting error. And understanding anti-Semitism would have helped avoid it. And I think that takes me back maybe to some of the positive stories legally that come out of the Holocaust that underscore what I think of as one of our key ideas here, that it's essential in doing anti-discrimination work to properly understand anti-Semitism, and it's essential to have good legal work to get that understanding integrated into the relevant parts of anti-discrimination law, both domestically and internationally. I want to talk about how that's showed up in the Holocaust context through what I think are two positive stories. And I'm going to talk about denial in the sense of the IRA definition of denial and distortion, and the related UN one that Yfat talked about earlier. As Ken explained at the beginning of the program, Holocaust denial relies on at least two of those elements of anti-Semitic discourse that show up in a fact sheet we've published on it: conspiracy and greed, right? We know one of the most common anti-Semitic lies is about shadowy Jewish control of public institutions, including those that disseminate information, like the press. Then another one is about secretive Jewish cabals manipulating people. And then a third lie is about Jewish greed. And denial typically involves falsely accusing a secretive Jewish cabal of fabricating information to manipulate others for their own benefit: conspiracy, control of information, manipulation, and greed. An anti-Semitic bingo card. So the first positive story, I think, to tell about what the law has said about this is that the law, not just in the United States, but many countries, has recognized that Holocaust denial is an anti-Semitic bingo card and not a factual debate. Here in the US, we don't criminalize hate speech, but speech may serve as an indication that conduct is motivated by bias. And when we see hate speech, we should respond to it ourselves with our own speech and denounce it. So recognizing hate speech for what it is important. In the US, Executive Order 13899, which makes the IRA definition part of federal law for agencies considering allegations of anti-Semitic discrimination, and which incorporated much of Ken's work, helps us do that. Now, it's not the aspect that's talked about the most, but because it incorporates the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and its examples, it incorporates three different examples that say Holocaust denial, distortion, or inversion, comparing the victims of the Holocaust to the perpetrators of it, are anti-Semitic, and so are indicators that conduct is motivated by anti-Semitism. And similarly, in European countries that have denial laws, but also respect principles of free speech, the guillotine effect, what it's called, of the European Convention on Human Rights, has been used to uphold those laws because people understand that Holocaust denial is inherently anti-Semitic. The other positive story to tell is that it's the law that has led us to be able to say confidently that Holocaust denial isn't a factual debate, because it's lawyers and trials that vetted the underlying allegations and gave us the kind of certainty that we have now, that overcame the lack of belief from well-placed people that Ben was talking about. Even in front of demanding courts, one of the chambers at the Nuremberg trials, the one hearing the famous Einsatzgruppen case, said the allegations were so massive, they demanded assurances bolstered 100 times over. But the evidence that was collected by lawyers like Justice Jackson or like Ben Ferencz, who recently won a Congressional Gold Medal for his work, and the other prosecutors at Nuremberg was so overwhelming that it met that burden. And it's that level of certainty, that level of proof, that allowed us to say denial isn't a factual debate, allowed us to have that kind of certainty, that kind of confidence. And the third thing I think that's a success story there at Nuremberg is thinking about comparing it to the story that Ben told about reporting, that they were explicit. Justice Jackson, for instance, was explicit that this was a crime that was anti-Semitic, that was targeted at Jews. And he was explicit too about the uniqueness of it. And that's where I want to close. One of the things that Justice Jackson said in court was this: let there be no misunderstanding about the charge of persecuting Jews. What we charge against these defendants is not those arrogances and pretensions which frequently accompany the intermingling of different peoples, and which are likely, despite the honest efforts of government, to produce regrettable crimes and convulsion. It is my purpose to show a plan and design to which all Nazis were fanatically committed to annihilate all Jewish people. These crimes were organized and promoted by the party leadership, executed and protected by the Nazi officials, as we shall convince you by written orders of the secret state police itself. The avowed purpose was the destruction of the Jewish people as a whole, as an end in itself, as a measure of preparation for war, and as a discipline for conquered peoples. And he explained that this plan was so methodically and thoroughly pursued that despite the German defeat and Nazi prostration, it had largely, in Europe, succeeded. He closed this section by saying, history does not record a crime ever perpetrated against so many victims, or one ever carried out with such calculated cruelty. I think I'll end there. I think it's a good way of leaving us with the importance of this holiday and the importance of maintaining memory.
Thank you very much, Arthur. There was a question posted as to whether this is going to be available online, and yes, it's being recorded, and we will be putting it up on our YouTube channel and sending it out, so you'll be able to get a copy and share it with others. We're going to bring everybody in now for a conversation and a discussion on these topics. There was one very specific question, Ben, that's been posted for you, asking whether there's actually data about the absence of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's Jewish identity in the mainstream press after she died, or whether this was just more of a anecdote and something that you had noticed. So I don't know if you want to answer that question first.
Yeah, I saw that. And unfortunately, there's no data with regards to that. It really was just something I noticed. And there were articles that absolutely centered her Jewishness. I know the Washington Post wrote them, a couple of those. So yeah, I'm afraid it was just something I noticed at the time. Sorry.
One thought that I've had listening to everyone, and as I think about erasive anti-Semitism, is it does seem that today, with increasing frequency, what you find is, some call it the double standard, but there's a recognition that if you're going to call out and condemn discrimination or harassment of ethnic groups, that's recognized as standing up for human and civil rights of those groups. But when it comes to trying to call out the discrimination against Jews, very often people are not comfortable doing that because they say, well, that's a political statement. And I actually think that the only reason you can try and mask and hide the discrimination against Jews is if you erase the Jewish identity, right? It's only if you refuse to recognize that Jews are a people, you refuse to recognize the discrimination of Jews as a people, as an ethno-religion, that you can then claim that what's happening is really just a political debate. If you recognize Jews as the ethno-religion, then you have to be able to recognize the discrimination against them on that basis, the same way you would recognize it as against others. One of the things that I thought was interesting, Arthur, when you were going through and talking about the proving how the trials proved and the evidence, the problem that we face more broadly, right, with the erasive anti-Semitism is, for example, the ADL recently came out with a study that says over 85% of Americans believe at least one anti-Semitic trope. And how can you prove Jews aren't greedy, Jews aren't part of a conspiracy, Jews aren't, right? Is that really what would be necessary to address the anti-Semitism and the erasive anti-Semitism? And if you can't do that, what are the steps that we could take to better address what we see happening now in terms of the distortion and the denial and the erasure of our history and our identity?
So I'll maybe take that first, although I don't think it's solely a legal question, and I'll be curious what Ben and Yfat think too. I think a couple of things. The first thing I think is that these are stereotypes that are put across in general, almost universal terms. And anytime you're saying all members of group A have characteristic B, unless that characteristic is they're human beings, you're probably going a bad direction. And I think the law often, when it looks at evidence of discrimination or discriminatory intent in discrimination cases, considers those types of generalizations. Beyond that, I think you're right that it's hard to mirror this type of evidence in a lot of other situations. I think personally, though without any particularly rigorous data analysis, fond of teaching cross-cultural communication, teaching tolerance, teaching things that help people resist the temptation to draw those kind of racist generalizations and stereotypes. I think that's as far as I'd go as a litigator in trying to answer what I think is a policy question, maybe above a litigator's pay grade.
Ben.
I also think that in terms of, there has to be a recentering of Jewish identity. And I think particularly in North America, and I think that, I'm not from North America, obviously. So when I speak about Jews from North America, I'm speaking with absolutely no judgment or really criticism. It's just kind of an observation of what I saw growing up. And I think that there were trends in the United States, particularly and also Canada to an extent, which saw Jews believe that they had made it. I've been told that even in the last 4 months, that we don't need pride, we don't need to center ourselves, it's icky because we made it. I think there's also a really interesting conversation to be had about what does it mean when Jews make it. But I think that we need to remember that we are Jews. And that seems like a very obvious thing. But I think when, there's various communal experiences in Jewish history, the United States more recently, but also Germany in the 19th century, where there was a desire to integrate and assimilate to an extent more than there was a desire to preserve Jewishness. And I think forgetting that there is a historic reality, a historic connection, a historic substance of being a Jew, then it's very dangerous. And to reinforce that is education. I think that I hope everyone would agree in this call and the people listening that we've really dropped the ball actually when it comes to education. I have the privilege of educating Jews online from all over the world, and in many of these sessions I'm asked, why don't I know this? And listen, it's an hour session, right? You're not really going super in depth, but there's basic information that we don't know. There are Jews who genuinely believe that we are indigenous to Europe, and this is the problem. We believe the non-Jews. Erasive Jew hatred is one thing, right? The reality is we cannot stop them saying what they want to say about us. We cannot stop them believing the things that they believe about us, however maddening and however frustrating that is. But it takes on another layer of danger when we start to believe it. And there are certainly many Jews, North America, Britain, Europe, South Africa, Australia, all over the world, even in Israel, who have believed non-Jewish definitions of our identity, non-Jewish definitions of our experience. And that, I think, is crucial. There's almost two different conversations that take place here. One is, what is the internal Jewish response? And then what is the response with how we engage with the wider community?
Okay, I'll build on that. You started your remark, Alyza, with mentioning paradox, and it made me think of two relevant paradoxes here. One that we see a lot, especially these days on Holocaust denial distortion, which is between claiming that the Holocaust didn't happen and claiming that the Jews are using the Holocaust for different reasons. And how do you deal with that? It's on the one hand, denial of the Holocaust or its capacity, and then also claiming that you're using it for your own benefit, or you're exaggerating, or, as I said, talking about it too much. And how do we deal with that paradox? And we see it not just in the US, not just on campuses, but it's obviously very strong in the progressive leftist discussions. And I think that's one issue that we still fail to deal with, but it's also a little bit hard to deal with a paradox like that. So I'll leave that. The other, which also relates to what Arthur and Ben mentioned, I do work with, I'm in North America. I do work with a lot of communities, Jewish communities in Europe and other places. And we see different forms of this discussion in different areas. So in the US, as you mentioned, Arthur, it's where the Jews are in society, between, on the one hand, again, the kind of extremism right, putting Jews as Jews, not part of the white supremacist discussion, and progressive and left and left, putting Jews in the white category. And then when we go to Europe, for example, we're having the complete opposite discussion, and we're trying to claim, we're trying to give some unique space for the anti-Jewish hate, for anti-Semitism, because in Europe, a lot of the discussion is about, let's just put this discussion as part of racism and discrimination in general, without looking at any of the unique characteristics that relate to being Jewish and what it is that to be racist against Jew and hating Jew. And that has specific, we're talking about the Holocaust, so how that relates to the discussion. And a lot of times in Europe and in European institutions, when we come and say, let's look at anti-Semitism and let's combat anti-Semitism specifically, it becomes part of this more general discussion about racism. It's also part of kind of erasing the specific Jewish identity and Jewish issues. And we kind of have to deal with that in some places, in some countries. On the other hand, in some areas, placing Jews as unique and different, and a different discussion. And I find that paradox, we deal with it almost on a daily basis, very challenging and interesting to deal with as well.
Thank you. Ken, you've joined our conversation. I don't know if you have a question that you would like to pose or comment.
I would love to. So to start with, especially since we're here with Ben Freeman, who literally wrote the book on Jewish pride, we plagiarize him where we can, credit him where we must. I'm feeling a lot of Jewish pride right now in this extraordinary panel, 3 excellent presentations, splendidly moderated with I would say a very nice set of links on the side, well curated, I think, by my colleagues, Ben Alkin and Scott Pirro. People sometimes say that we shouldn't talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we'll be misunderstood. And that makes me want to talk about DEI so that we won't be misunderstood. I think Arthur Traldi in his presentation very astutely discussed some of the problems. There are, of course, great opportunities with DEI. We work with DEI officers a great deal, where Jewish students or employees face discriminatory issues. Oftentimes it's DEI officials who are there to help. That is, after all, their job. And it is deeply ironic and disturbing when they are in fact part of the problem. My question, I would say, for each of our panelists, what do we say? What would you say when a DEI official says, they don't say, Jews are conspiratorial and a powerful cabal that's trying to take over the world. But they may say, we do not have a Jewish American Heritage Month commemoration, nor do we have a Jewish employee resource group, nor do we have a component of our anti-discrimination program that deals with anti-Semitism, even though we deal with other groups. And they might say, well, we focus in DEI on race and ethnicity, not on religion. Or they might say, we are focusing now on marginalized groups. Or they might say, we're trying now to focus on, and they might mention 2 or 3 other groups, and Jews are not one of those groups. So they might come up with one of those sorts of responses, and we deal with it from time to time. I wonder how you would speak with someone like that.
I would take the space to define Jewish experience and identity. And that really is a lot of what kind of progressive values are about, right? When after George Floyd was murdered in the Black Lives Matter protest, it was about listening, about doing the work. So I think what I tend to do is, because I agree with you, I think that DEI is here to stay, and B, there's certainly an opportunity there to discuss the Jewish experience in that context. We'd have to get through a couple of hurdles or go over a couple of hurdles. But I would very firmly and respectfully, but very firmly, take space to define Jewish experience and identity. And said, let me tell you what it means to be a Jew. Let me tell you about my experience, my family's experience, how I experience walking down the street. Let's look at other situations. I think it often shocks some people in North America that in Britain, I don't even use the word anti-Semitism really anymore. Jew hatred is legally a racism. So if I'm targeted in the street when I wear a kippah because I'm Magen David, that is a racially aggravated hatred. And I also think that when we have to take the space, we also have to help them grow and learn. And the idea that Jews don't experience racism, because really that's what a lot of this is about. Even the FBI would say that anti-Jewish hatred is a religiously motivated hate crime, or anti-Jewish hate crimes are religiously motivated, which I think is kind of crazy in all honesty that that's how it's defined. But it's that is the narrative we have. So it's about helping people grow. So we look at the term racism. What does it mean? Racism is a verb. Races don't exist. That was a category created by people to put people in boxes. And never, I think Arthur, you said this, never complimentary. It was never a nice thing. Racism is a verb. So we are racialized. Okay, let's look at the history of being racialized. There's an Asian American professor who says that the first racist state in the West was England and it targeted Jews in the Middle Ages. Okay, let's look at other examples when Jews are racialized. It's about helping them expand their minds, helping them understand prejudice from a wider context, because particularly in North America, particularly in the US, it's very narrow, right? It's the color of skin, whereas the world literally isn't split into black and white. There's a myriad of different experiences that we have to help people understand. And we also have to be proud enough to take space and to say, let me tell you what it means to be a Jew. Let me tell you about my family's experience, my European family's experience in, Belarus. It wasn't fun. Why did they flee? Why did my grandfather come to Glasgow as a baby? He was a refugee. There's a huge amount of ignorance. And the last thing I'll say, because I've droned on a wee bit, is when we educate, initially start that conversation without shame and without judgment. Even if someone is saying something that bothers us, the reality is people have no idea about Jews. People have no idea about Jew hatred. And we have to help them grow and learn. If they're willing and open, wonderful. If they're not, then for sure you can get a little feisty. But start the conversation with education. Let me tell you. You don't know, and that's okay. Let me explain.
I love Ben's answer. I think hopefully you can hear me. But I do think there's another part of where we can occupy space. And we did a conference a few years ago, early COVID days. So we did it virtually, one of our first virtual conferences, just making, connecting this bridge between Jewish people and other marginalized groups. in both ways, not just educating about that, but also there was, the space was heavily occupied by Jewish people and Jewish organizations working together. And in recent years, recent decades, we've lost a lot of that connection. And I think we're working a lot to rebuild it. Our keynote speaker on our first day was actually the president of the NCAA, speaking about this, right? So educating ourselves about these connections and these spaces, but also just showing up and being there on a daily basis, making that, fighting that fight with our, our other marginalized communities, making sure that we stand up for them too. I think that's another space that's really important to occupy in these discussions.
I think I'd say a couple of things, but maybe as a framing point, what I'd want to be saying to a staff member in a position like that is, your Jewish students are or your Jewish employees are just asking for equal treatment to people from other groups. And illustrating why that's the case is the question of fact and the question of marshaling evidence for them. I think the easiest place to maybe correct a misimpression, Ken, is that first question you suggested they might ask, like, we do race or ethnicity, we don't do religious inclusion programming. And there, I think Ben and Yfat have both given great answers. The only thing I'd add is it's a uniquely, I don't know, maybe not entirely uniquely, but close to uniquely American idea to be surprised by the idea that there would be overlap between religion and ethnicity. In most of the world, that's not surprising. And reminding them of that context, I think, is valuable. I've been in the position of citing examples from international ethnic conflict cases and saying, look, in the United States, we would say these two peoples are both from the same type of group because we have a more generalized definition, but that's clearly not the experience they were having at the time. And it takes, to use this word for a second time in one program, but it takes a lot of chutzpah to tell them that they're wrong about what their own experience is. And there is a little bit, going back to our theme of erasure, in asking that, not necessarily in asking that question, but in refusing to listen to the answer and accepting the self-definition of your students, your employees, your people who are having that experience of being targeted for being Jewish. And then on marginalization and choosing what groups to focus on, I think it is a matter of marshaling evidence and making a good argument that Jews have substantial needs, and needs that require them to be included in order to be treated equally with other marginalized and targeted groups. And I wanted to say maybe two things about that. The first is that I think religion does play in, that I think one of the things at workplaces, at universities, that affects or leads to marginalization is scheduling, and the fact that Jewish holidays are very restrictive, and also are not reflected in a typical American holiday calendar. The second is to acknowledge, we're talking about problems, but of course, as people have repeatedly said, the United States is one of the better places in history to be Jewish. There are bigger problems elsewhere in the diaspora. That doesn't mean, however, that these aren't problems that need to be solved, need to be fought, and need to be addressed properly. Ideally through law.
We just have a couple of minutes, and I want to, I think, tie together some of the comments that were made here with some of the questions that were remaining. I agree with Ben when he says that we need to center the Jewish identity conversation, and the Jewish individuals need to have the confidence to step forward and say that. One of the problems and the challenges that we find is when Yfat talks about how sometimes you're talking too much about the Holocaust, you're making this all about the Jews. Jews feel very uncomfortable. They're in many ways intimidating. There was a question that talked about, well, talking about Jewish conspiracies, isn't that just designed to silence the Jewish effort to try and do exactly this? And my hope is that this program, right, will give Jews the confidence to realize that it's not just to help solve a Jewish problem, it's actually to address society's problem. If the Jews don't have the courage to speak up and try and educate people about what Jewish identity is so that the world can see the anti-Semitism, we know what happens to societies where anti-Semitism festers. It rots and destroys all the values that we hold dear. So it's our responsibility to actually step forward and say that. And I hope that that would be something that this program would help people. And then there was a question from a non-Jew who said, what can I do to help? And I actually think helping create that space, helping provide that support for Jews to engage and center the conversation about Jewish identity without any, shame or blame, as Ben was saying, just the idea of trying to make space and say, wait, Jews need to be included too. For non-Jews to stand up and say that would be extremely, extremely helpful. So I'm going to actually now turn it back over to Ken to just close us out. And thank you all for a really wonderful conversation. You're on mute, Ken.
Alyza, thank you for that great closing, as well as for the moderation. And thank you to each of our participants for their excellent presentations, and to my colleagues who helped put this together. While this brings Shine a Light month to an end, nevertheless, we continue in our work, which will include additional webinars. Keep an eye on brandeiscenter.com for more events. Sign up for our mailing list if you would like to be informed of future events. And beyond that, if we can help within our mission to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. And in particular, if there are Jewish college and university students who need our help in fighting anti-Semitism on campus, please reach us via our website, brandeiscenter.com. To everyone who has joined us, we thank you, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care, everyone.